We just spent 3 days tuning some of the best memory we've ever worked with on the Intel i5-10400, the AMD R5 3600, the AMD R3 3300X, and a couple of others. And the point of all of this was to create a chart that was completely filled from top to bottom with memory timings and frequencies as tested, particularly on the i5-10400. That's because in our 10400 review, we showed that you really shouldn't buy the CPU. There is an argument to be made for OEM systems, and there's an argument to be made for developers, or someone who wants an IGP, doesn't overclock, whatever. More basic tasks. But for our core audience, don't buy it. That's what we said in the review, and that conclusion was reached specifically because you end up losing most of the features that a Z490 board has to offer if you buy it with a Z490 board. But if you buy it because it's locked, it doesn't have a K at the end of it. But if you buy it with a more appropriate B or H board, you lose the memory speed options, at least past a certain frequency. And that ends up killing performance. But the arguments that we received from other people online, we'll leave it there, I guess, was that why didn't you just tune the timings? You can just tune the timings of 2666 or 2933 to be tighter. So we did that. Got them down to CL10 for 2666. But we also invested equal effort in the competing parts because that's fair. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX. The PureBase 500DX is a new push from Be Quiet into mesh-fronted cases that are more thermally focused. The 500DX maintains high build quality and attention to detail for its dust filters, front panel installation, and fan placement, and still has additional focus on noise control. The case comes with 3 140mm PureWings 2 fans stock and has RGB LEDs, but with a physical hardware switch for easy control. Learn more about the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX at the link in the description below. All right, so quick backstory then. Again, the non-Z motherboards historically have been limited to whatever the supported frequency is for the processor. Technically, none of Intel's processors that we've reviewed lately even support 3200 out of the box. It's not like their baseline spec. Just like AMD's baseline in the past wasn't 3200. Things have changed. But obviously, XMP changes that. Difference is that Intel, with XMP on B and H motherboards, you get the timings, you don't get the frequency, at least if it's above whatever the limit is. That's going to be 2666 or 2933, and the board and the CPU both play a role in which of those two numbers it'll be. Both, obviously, are lower than what you would get on a Z-series board. But you should only really buy a Z-series board if you're buying a K-SKU CPU, especially this generation, because Intel has invested so much into the overclocking support, and the motherboard manufacturers have too, and you lose all of that with a non-K CPU. So we're going to be revisiting this. We had a couple questions asking, well, what if you tuned the 10400? Would it then become comparable to a 3600, 3300X, whatever it may be? And the answer is, well, I mean, yeah, but you got to tune the other one too, because that's fair. So we set a 1-day time limit for all of these parts. 10600K, we had already done. The 3600 we needed to do. The 3300X we had already invested about half a day into previously. The 10400 we needed to do. So we had a time limit on each of these in a given amount of time and under a work day. How far could you get the CPU reasonably with its memory? So for K-SKUs and for AMD's parts, that means overclocking everything. For the 10400, that means only overclocking or tuning the memory to the capacity that would be supported by our theoretical HRB motherboard. In our efforts then to get the 10400 to claw back its performance lost from our baseline 3200 14 benchmarks that we do for all of our CPUs, standardized reviews memory, to get it back to that level from 2666, we dropped in a kit of $300 memory. This is genuinely the most insane memory I've ever worked with, actually. So this is the, if you want it, F4 4000 C15D 16 GTRS. It's 2 sticks of 8. We dropped that in there. $300 RAM, we had to ask G-Skill for it, obviously, and worked with it for a while. And $300 RAM, $180 CPU, and then a Maximus 12 Extreme motherboard with our i5-10400 non-K part. We tuned all of it, and the results are interesting because even then, it's kind of rough for the 10400. But the biggest part is doing equal tuning for everything that's being tested against each other. Quick important note too, we worked with basically all of the secondary timings, worked with all of the primary timings. Tertiary, we left about half of them alone, played around with the rest. So it's not just primary timings here. The lower level timings have a massive impact on performance, especially things like RFC and TFAW. So those are modified too, but we only have so much room in a chart. And if we get an article up with this, we'll try to list some more detail for each one. Let's get into the numbers. We'll start with Hitman 2 since it shows good scaling. The 10400 original review numbers had it at 121 FPS average for the 3200 MHz test, which assumes, by the way, a Z490 motherboard paired with your $180 locked non-K CPU, and it followed with an average of 102 FPS for the 2666 more reasonable result as suited for the B&H motherboards. The most ridiculous tune we did was 2666 at CL10, marked as A, which took us about half a day or so of work to dial in, approaching a day, on $300 memory, including tuning for half of the lower down timings. So that'd be things like TFAW, tRFC, TCWL, CKE, pulse width, and all the other stuff alongside those. The result was about 117 FPS average for all of that work. So that's a $300 kit of memory for your $180 CPU on presumably a $100 B/H motherboard, otherwise you'd be running a higher frequency. So you can have, for all of that, performance that outperforms a $120 3300X stock CPU with our standard kit of review memory. And it outperforms it by 2.6% versus the 3200 CL14 test that we did for the 3300X. The original 3200 CL14 10400 result still leads this result, by the way, by 3.7%. So for anyone complaining why we didn't waste literally days manually tuning the timings on CPUs, especially one that no one should buy like the 10400, this is your answer. Like we said before, it's an arms race. You can do this for every CPU that we test. We spent another day tuning the 10600K to keep it fair, and it ended up at 147 FPS average. The 10400 isn't even close. We spent a day tuning the 3600 as well, and we got the memory up to 3866, 1515, 1534, and 1:1:1, M clock, U clock, and F clock. That placed at 128 FPS average, tying a stock 10600K CPU at 3200 CL14 and outperforming the 10400 super-tuned CL10 A listing by 9%. We spent equal time on both of these CPUs. Adding a maximum cache ratio to 43x on the 10400 got us a little bit further. It gets you to 117 FPS average with the settings on the chart, so it still loses by a rough mile. Assuming 2933 is supported on B&H boards for 10400, which isn't confirmed, we maxed that out at about 119 FPS average with our D listing at 12, 12, 12, 28. So the 3600 still wins here because it's simply open for tuning and overclocking, as is the 10600K. If you shove $300 of RAM into the sockets of a $200 Z490 motherboard for your locked $180 10400, you can benefit from a 129 FPS average in this bench. Or you could just buy something that actually makes sense instead, like a 10600K RAM that costs a third of the price and still manages 7% more performance at 138 FPS average. But to each their own. It costs the same for both of those two example configurations. F1 is up next, another highly scalable title. In this one, the original review 3200 number landed at 247 FPS average, which looks pretty competitive against the stock 3600's 226 FPS average, until we remember that you can't really OC the RAM on B&H boards historically, and at the same time, that 3600 is fully unlocked on its platform. The 216 FPS average number is our baseline instead for this. With the $300 Trident Z kit and our day of investment, item A ends up at 242 FPS average. It has successfully managed to basically equate our original 3200 CL14 result, and all it took was just tuning TCWL, TCKE, TFAW, tRFC, TCL, TRCD, TRAS, TRDS, TRDL, TRTP, TREFI, TWTRL, TWTRS, TRDR, TWR, and a couple of others that are also a mouthful. So we assume that when people asked why we didn't just tune the timings, this is probably what they had in mind. That seems like what they would have thought of. So all that done, the performance isn't really that exciting at the locked 2666 megahertz. It's clear that frequency matters. The 3600 with a 4350 megahertz tune ends up about equal to the 3200 megahertz numbers or the heavily tuned 10400 numbers at around 244 FPS average for the 36 at 4350. For the 36 at 4400 megahertz, that puts us at 247 FPS average. The 10600K, meanwhile, still roughly outperforms all of this stock. It's beaten by the C entry, though, of the 10400 with 4000 megahertz RAM on Z490. Going against what anyone would actually use, of course. The 10600K with its own armaments hits 285 FPS average, managing to lead once again. The 3300X, meanwhile, has its own tune, running at 242 FPS average. With cheaper memory, less time committed, and a $120 CPU. That's the tune that Patrick did for a previous piece, and we didn't spend nearly as much time on it as we did for the rest of these. Assuming some BH boards can do 2933 for the 10400 marked D, we've also included that just to be safe. And that's at 247 FPS average with a tune there, under the 43X RIN of Mark E at 2666 CL10. The 10400 makes absolutely no sense to buy if you're going to do all of this work and all of this research. If you enjoy that stuff, that's awesome. But please buy an unlocked part, either from AMD or Intel, and if it's Intel, buy a Z-Series board with it. Because at this point, you're an OC enthusiast, and you should be proud of that, and it's really fun, but getting into all this stuff and then buying into a CPU that only lets you change a quarter of the things, it's a waste of money if you're that type of enthusiast. GTA 5 is next. The original review results were 106 FPS average with 3200 CL14 on Z490 and 97 FPS average for CL15 2666, representing where we assume B&H boards will be stuck. In this case, the performance gap was only 10%, whereas most other games showed a 14% performance lead with better RAM. Dropping to 2666 and CL10 brought us to 107 FPS average, so a jaunt of about 10% in exchange for all of the work. The 3300X moved from 104 FPS average to 106 FPS average with some pretty basic tuning, putting it within error of the A-listing CL10 result of the $180 10400. So once again, the memory tune alone isn't really enough. Maxing out the cache ratio to 43, the limit of the 10400, at least on the Z board we used, the Maximus Extreme, that helped us bring our average up to 112 FPS. But 0.1% lows show that frame time consistency was bad and that stability was suspect, something we'll look at more in a moment. The 46 FPS average number looks better than reality for 0.1%, and we'll show why in a second. This game seems more cache-starved than others, as evidenced by the 10600K stock 3200 CL14 average of 114, jumping to 128 from just adjusting the cache ratio. Nothing else. No memory tune, no overclock, only cache ratio. So that's a 12% jaunt for just that change. And that's the only thing we changed there. The memory was our standard review memory for that one. As we said in the first piece, it's an arms race. So it doesn't matter if you can overclock or tune the 10400 because you can also overclock or tune the 10600K, the 3300X, the 3600, and with a worse starting position for the 10400 and assumed equal time invested in all parts, because realistically, if you're saying you're going to tune one of these, then you'll tune the other one the same amount. You still shouldn't buy the 10400. Maybe developers could justify it for the IGP, but that's about it from our perspective. People who need an IGP, sure, go for it. People who aren't overclocking and need an IGP, go for it. It's cheaper than the 10600K. Maybe you don't care about high FPS, whatever. Otherwise, AMD and Intel have other offerings on either side of it that make more sense. Now back to the GTA 5 chart. A more reasonable tune would be Mark F, 11, 13, 13, 28, which we assume most people would be able to do with pretty minimal work. But that doesn't even reach parity with the 3200 CL14 kit. Meanwhile, investing equal effort into tuning the 3600, as we did the 10400 on a simulated B or H board, got us to 116 FPS average, right between the 10600K results. The 10400 can't keep up on its slower frequency, period, for the core frequency that is this time, especially if you test properly and you actually follow tau, PL1, and PL2. The argument of just tuning the memory goes both ways here, and it's not fair to only do it on one platform if that argument is going to be made in favor of the other platform. You have to do it on both. As for the frame rate issue, here's a look at that. The frame time plots are the closest representation of player experience interval to interval, with lower being better. More consistent is best. A frame time of about 16.66 milliseconds would be 60 FPS, but frame rate is an abstraction from the base metric of time. So the frame time plot better represents the stutters you would encounter. As seen here, there are several spikes up to 100 milliseconds, but it's actually way worse than that. We just zoomed this chart in for the first run through so that you could see the beginning of the test. Here's the real chart. We have frame time spikes upwards of 900 milliseconds, which means you'd be waiting almost an entire second from one frame to the next. The 43x cache ratio wasn't stable in this test. More voltage didn't help, so we would just have to lower it to 42x or lower in this instance. But otherwise, the reason the numbers came out the way they did in the previous chart is because you're averaging multiple runs, so thousands and thousands of cells of data, but only these couple of frames popped up during all of that. So even with 0.1% lows, which get us closer to this, we still aren't close enough to see these values, and that's why we need the Frametime chart. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next. The review 10400 3200 number held 155 FPS average, allowing the stock 10600K a lead of 5.3%. The 2666 CL15 number had us at 135 FPS average, equal to the 3300X stock. The 3300X jumps to 141 FPS average with a lighter tune. Working for a day on the tertiary and secondary timings for the 10400 tune, we got up to 154 FPS average, back to 3200 CL14 primary levels. The 10600K, meanwhile, demonstrates that it's actually bouncing off of a GPU limit with a simpler tune. Investing, again, equal effort into the 3600 tune, we end up at 157 FPS average, allowing the stock 10600K a lead of 3.7%, or the max overclocked, in fairness, 10600K is 177 FPS average, a lead of 13%. The 10400, meanwhile, ends up below the 3600 entirely, except for its one instance of ridiculously good RAM, a Z490 board, and some tuning work. We've pretty much proven the point by now, but let's look at one last chart for Total War's campaign benchmark. In this one, the original 10400 results had it at 132 FPS average with 3200 CL14 Z490 results, or a chart bottoming 115 FPS average with the 2666 CL15 RAM. Tuning to what we think is an achievable 11, 13, 13, 28 got us to 125 FPS average, a bump of 13%, over the 2666 CL15 result. That's cool, and it does aid the argument of the 10400, but only if you ignore that you can also overclock every other part of the bench. Doing the same work for the 3600 gets it to 139 FPS average, leading the 10600K stock result by 1 FPS, so we're within error. And it also leads the 4000 MHz CL15 10400 result by 3%, which is not within error. The 10600K Max OC still leads everyone by a lot at 159 FPS average, but the real point is that the 10400 can be outtuned by every other part that's nearby in price, particularly the similarly priced 3600. The cheaper 3300X lightweight tune even gets it close to the F result of the 10400, and the 10600K obviously has plenty of room above it. That's the numbers then. So to answer the question of if you wanted true apples to apples, you did it the wrong way. Steve knows he should have dropped 3200 to 2666, and so on. I mean, I knew the answer already, but we've invested 3 days in proving it. So there you go. There's the numbers. The 10400 still loses, surprise, and the 3600, if you invest equal time tuning it, is able to actually do better than we even suspected previously. So that was good information to take away from this. Couple of notes. First of all, please don't harass other reviewers when we post things that may disagree with their opinions. Multiple people can have multiple opinions. It's fine. It's not cool to see our commenters going and harassing other reviewers for their work, because everyone puts a lot of work into it, and we may come up with different numbers, but there's different testing methods, there's different opinions, and there's different beliefs as to what's okay for testing. So don't harass people. That's number one. I want to point that out right now. And secondly to that, one of the big beliefs we have is that you should test following Intel official guidance, which means not using the motherboard default out of the box untouched if that motherboard cheats, if it changes the settings, if it changes B clock silently, if it maxes out PL1, PL2, and tau, if it disregards Intel official guidance and makes the CPU better than how it is marketed and advertised, it's basically pre-overclocking it. And once you're basically pre-overclocking a CPU, you're in territory where now it's a slippery slope of for whom do you apply these changes? Do we also disable the limits on AMD boards? Because just because AMD enforces their limits better, it kind of makes it unfair if Intel's motherboard partners are running blasting PL1, PL2, and tau out of the box, which is way outside of the official spec in the spreadsheets that Intel sends out a lot of the time, or spreadsheets, the spec tables that you see online. If you allow that, then it's just, you got to allow the other stuff too. It makes Intel look bad also for power consumption. So they win and they lose. Just depends on what chart you're looking at. We've made that point before though, but that's our belief. And because of that, it means that our numbers will always be conservatively low, at least for now, based on the way the specs work now. And that's a good thing, because if you pre-overclock it out of the box, there's a good chance you'll have instability for some of the users. And we don't think that is a good user experience. And it's really best that AMD and Intel both have a set of rules that we enforce for both of them. And so that's where we draw the line. It has to follow the official power limits that are recommended by the company that makes the CPU. The motherboard makers don't have a say in it, in our opinion, in our reviews, because now you're not testing the CPUs, you're testing the motherboards. And that's different. So that may be a reason you see different numbers sometimes, but outside of that, obviously memory is a factor, and we've now accounted for that. And the 10400 is bad value, and you shouldn't buy it. Now, it's not an objectively bad CPU in that it performs reasonably. It's not like it's garbage tier, but it's not good value. So opinion remains the same. At the same price, you should buy a 3600 or 3300X for gaming if you want to save some money and put the rest of that into a GPU, which will often get you more performance anyway. Or you can go the opposite direction, spend more money, get a 10600K. It's a phenomenal CPU for the price point. Intel's done well to recover. We really enjoy it for overclocking. One of the best CPUs we've worked with recently for an enthusiast. So the 10600K is what we'd recommend if you can stretch the budget, or if you're buying Z490 anyway. The 33, 36 are what we recommend below that. Intel absolutely has to unlock its B&H boards to start competing better in enthusiast, and we'd like to see it move away from the non-K SKUs as well. Problem is, Intel sells so many damn CPUs to OEMs that we don't matter. None of us in the enthusiast audience matter to Intel. I mean, to an extent we do, but it's a subdivision of Intel. And ultimately, the business units that are handling Dell, HP, Lenovo, selling trays upon trays, millions of CPUs, they're the ones who make the decisions that affect this. And so it's unlikely this will change, but we do want to see it change if possible. IGP is a justification for the 10400 that we didn't point out in the first video. That was a good point that some of our commenters made. One of our commenters said to be a developer and said they could use an IGP in the CPU and get the performance. So that's a good justification for it. Otherwise, outside of sort of mainstream desktop use, we don't really like it, at least outside of a Z board, and then you should buy something else. As for the memory though, it's not cheap to get the performance we got in some of these charts, so keep that in mind too. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. To support us directly, go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus and check back for other videos. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.